Hey guys, it's Steve from Featherlight Studio, and in this video, we're going to check out the brand new Aura Beat Composer from Nektar. Now, I've already done a complete comparison video on how this stacks up against our Akai MPD-226, and if you're interested in that video, I'll leave it in the links below. But in this, we're going to focus exclusively on the Nektar and what makes this such a unique pad controller right now at the moment, especially for things like finger drumming and really highly sensitive applications. So let's dive in and check out a little bit more about why this is getting so much buzz right now. The Aura Beat Composer is a 16-pad MPC-style drum controller, and it's housed in a machine aircraft aluminum chassis with a brushed metal gray exterior, which makes it lightweight and portable, but also built to last. Everything about its construction feels premium, from its solid rubberized tactile pads and switches to its damped continuous control bank of knobs. Everything feels super high quality. For a quick comparison to our existing Akai MPD-226 pad controller, the Aura is a little smaller all the way around, at about 12 inches wide by 9 inches deep, but it stands a little taller at 2.5 inches. Both the Aura Beat controller and the Akai MPD-226 are generic MIDI controllers only, which means neither device can store or manipulate any kind of onboard sounds. However, the Aura Beat Composer comes with its own built-in hardware step sequencer, and the Akai does not. The benefit of these both being generic MIDI controllers, unlike other pad controllers that may be tied to their own proprietary operating systems, is these can be used to trigger external hardware sound sources like drum machines and synthesizers. The Aura has 16 soft, hypersensitive MPC-style pads with 16 banks. It's got 8 heavy-duty resistance damped assignable knobs, full-color backlit TFT display, 4 TFT display multifunction soft buttons, 8 assignable backlit dual-color Nectarine soft buttons. It's got 6 multifunction mode soft buttons, backlit dedicated transport controls, extensive tap tempo and note repeat functions, 16 internal configuration hardware presets, a hardware step sequencer with up to 64 total steps per pad, 16 RGB LED illuminated sequencer soft buttons. Each drum pad can hold 4 independent patterns, and the drum pads can trigger pattern playback independently for live performance. The Aura Beat Composer also has the same USB Type-B connector as well as a dedicated power switch, and like the Akai, can also be powered via an AC adapter. It has a full-size 5-pin DIN MIDI out connector built into the chassis itself. A 1/4-inch style TRS dual foot switch jack allows up to 2 different external foot switches to be used at the same time, and a Kensington lock rounds out the last of the Aura's rear connections. Just like our trusted Akai pad controller, the Aura Beat Composer can be powered via USB, but it can also be powered by plugging into a standard USB AC charger like this dual unit shown here. This is great for studio setups, standalone operation, or triggering other hardware where you may not have the device plugged into a computer. The Aura Beat Composer can store 16 internal hardware presets for use with a variety of external music gear, and that's completely separate from its nearly unlimited amount of presets that it can use with its companion software, Nectarine. Loading presets is straightforward. We simply hit the load button and we can cycle through all the available presets in the hardware simply by rotating the first knob, or we can also simply hit load and then striking a pad, as each one of the pads represents each one of the preset locations 1 through 16 that are currently in the machine itself. To load a preset, we simply hit the pad that has the preset and release. Saving a preset works just as simply. We simply hit the save button. We can rotate our first knob here. This steps through the available choice of presets. We can overwrite or choose an empty one. When we release, we can either choose to rename the preset, or we can hit the back button, which takes us back to the save menu. From here, we simply hit enter. Our preset is saved. Pad configuration for the Aura is equally straightforward. With the internal mode button illuminated, simply press the MIDI assigned soft button under the display, and then tap on any of the pads in the currently selected bank to reveal its current pad configuration in the color display window. To change any of the pad settings, simply select the pad and adjust the parameter in real time. One of the first things you'll notice about the Aura Beat Composer is the pads themselves are strikingly different than the hard rubber pads you'll find on the Akai. The Aura Beat Composer pads are much softer and have a bit of give to them when you press into them, almost like a real drum head. This allows for much more expressive control, especially for things like live performance and finger drumming. The first 4 knobs on the top of the Beat Composer correspond to the top row of parameters, and the second row of knobs, 5 through 8, correspond to the bottom row that sits directly underneath the top row of parameters. In the upper left-hand corner starts our pad-specific MIDI assignment settings. Here we're adjusting the MIDI note number, which is expressed as an actual note. This can be changed to MIDI CC info by altering the pressure settings. Next to that, we can set our individual pad's MIDI transmission channel, or it can conform to the global setting. Third option from the right is the note message type, whether it's going to trigger a one-shot sound, toggle a sound on or off, or be set to none. In our 4th knob position is the data entry type. The default is decimal, or it can be hex. In our 5th knob position, starting here on the bottom row, is our pressure sensitivity settings. These can be fixed to velocity and have minimum and maximum values that can be set. These can also be individual step settings in a variety of types. They can be individual toggle settings in a variety of types, each with their most significant and least significant bit settings. They can be channel aftertouch, polyphonic aftertouch, and can even generate pitch bend info. Or the pad's pressure sensitivity settings can be set to generate MIDI continuous controller information. If we hit the soft button under pad config, this takes us to page 2 of our menu configuration options, the first of which is color. Here we can set the color of the pad itself, and the next setting is the thing that really sets the Aura Beat Composer apart from most other pad controllers, is the pad sensitivity setting that can be set individually for each one of the pad's trigger mechanisms. This allows for each pad to have its own tailor-made response, and it accounts for the variations in the manufacturing of triggers themselves, since no 2 triggers would be exactly the same, or the responses in the chassis they're mounted in. As you can see here, there is a huge range of sensitivity steps available for the setting. The default is 0, and both positive and negative numbers can be entered into the thousands, allowing nearly surgical control until the pad reaches its maximum trigger responsiveness, at which point the pad simply glows white and stops responding until you lower the value. Pressing and holding the pot select soft button while rotating any of the potentiometers allows you to instantly program those configurations as well. Next up, if we press the internal or back soft button, it takes us back to our main page here, and that takes us to the Aura's global settings, which are equally as straightforward with a few additional features. On the first setting here is our global channel. This allows us to select a global channel the unit will operate on, and this is different than the individual pad transmission channels. Next up are our internal and external MIDI jack assignments. Set to internal, only the controls from the Aura will go out the external MIDI jack on the back. Set to USB, only the MIDI channel information coming from the computer will go out the external MIDI jack on the back. And the merge feature just combines both data streams out the external jack. Next up is the LED dim feature. This controls the dim state of each one of the LEDs. So for example, if we're in the sequencer mode, it controls how dark the LED in the background is dimmed versus the featured LED that's either lit or blinking. Pressing the internal button again and then global takes us back to our global settings. The 5th knob controls the 5th choice, which is all the pad's velocity curve choices, and there are several. The first of which is fixed, which is simply all the pads are full volume. So no matter how hard or light you play, the pads will produce full MIDI velocity. For those of you that are looking for advanced control over your velocity, the next mode is the most advanced of all, known as dynamic. This allows you to completely tailor the device surgically to your playing style. If we leave the default setting of max pressure at 6,000, that puts the middle of the graph somewhere around 3,100. At this midway point in the pressure setting, the pad will produce a MIDI velocity of about 80. If we change the output number here to be higher or lower than 80, we're effectively just making the curve more logarithmic or more exponential. If we change the default max pressure setting to higher than 6,000, we're effectively just making the graph longer and affecting the velocity response that relates to it. The third and most common of the choices is known as curve, and this is where we define the standard velocity curves that we're all used to playing with. At the machine's default of 100%, it's straight up linear. This is the most even-handed response of all, and it's the one we're most used to playing with. Anything below 100% becomes a logarithmic curve, and anything above 100% becomes an exponential curve. And the last of the available choices for the velocity curves is known as step. This simply takes all the pad's responses and reduces them down to a number of predefined steps, from 1 to 8 depending on the setting here. Next up, we're going to cover one of the Aura Beat Composer's strongest features, which is its step sequencer. For the time being, we're using Nektar's Nektarine software for its sound module, and we're going to cover more about that powerhouse software in a separate video. But for the time being, each of Aura's 16 pads can have their own sequences, up to 4 patterns each, all clocked to your project or internally, or it can be clocked to your own tap tempo settings as well. To keep things simple and straightforward, we've loaded up an instance of Contact with some drum sounds, and we've kept that one drum kit spread across all the pads for now. When we hit Step Sequencer, currently what we're looking at is none of the pads are active. So if we want to hear what pattern is on any of the pads, we simply touch the pad. The Run Stop Soft button in the sequencer menus controls global playback. The sequencer itself is running, and our pad strike simply starts or stops the pattern on each one of the pads that we strike. If we want to change the pattern, we simply change the buttons that are lighted on the top. From here, we can add or subtract any of the steps in the sequence until we get our desired kick drum pattern. Moving on to the next pad, which is currently our snare, the same thing applies. Simply striking the pad turns on or off the pattern that's currently assigned to it and shows the pattern in the step sequencer above. Remember, we can always go back to internal to audition the total sounds and what's on each pad currently. If we go back to sequence again, remember all the pads that are white are currently not playing, and the ones that are lighted are playing. All right, so let's hear what the hi-hat's doing. If we wanted to change that, simply hitting the soft buttons, so the same thing applies as before. This makes it a very intuitive and very familiar 16-step sequencer interface. So as long as the Run Stop button remains active, all of our pads are live and ready for live performance or recording into your DAW. It's a quick and intuitive and really powerful step sequencer program that allows you to not just stack sequences on top of one another and combine them, but combine them with massively assembled sounds and kits inside Nektarine. Coming up in the next video, we're going to take a deep dive into the included Nektarine software and find out more about its seamless integration with the Aura Beat Composer's hardware. So that's a quick look at the brand new Aura Beat Composer from Nektar. And as it turns out, those hypersensitive pads are really well suited for things like detail audio work and finger drumming. So if that's what you're into, this should definitely be on your short list. Hey, thanks for stopping by, you guys. If this was helpful in any way, please hit the subscription and notification bells. Stay safe out there. Be creative. We'll catch you guys in the next video.